It was Monday, December 11th, 1978. My wife Karen and I left Colorado City, where we lived. I was serving as pastor of First Baptist Church there. We got on I-25, went south to Raton Pass, which is the Colorado-New Mexico border. The first stage in our journey to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Hattiesburg is where my parents, and really the rest of my family, lived at the time. I figured out yesterday, during their lifetime, they moved a total of 20 times. Several of those during my lifetime as a child growing up. We were going there, we'd celebrate Christmas, but more importantly, that Saturday, December 16th, my sister Dawn was going to be married, and I would have the honor of performing the ceremony. So we went over the pass and came to the city of Raton, got off, got something to eat, a late lunch, and then we got on US 87 and started making our way across northeastern New Mexico toward the town of Clayton, and then shortly beyond that would come the border to the panhandle of Texas. We'd be well on our way. Well, we started down the highway from Raton and drove for a while, and it was just fine, and then some snowflakes began to fall. Well, no problem. I grew up in Michigan. I know how to drive in the snow. Well, the further east we went, the heavier the snow started to fall. Pretty soon I noticed, the ground is covered. It's all white. Got a little further down the road, and I began to notice, snow's starting to stick to the road. But there were still tracks you could follow. Got a little further down the road, and the road was completely covered. A little further, and it was almost like whiteout conditions. I had both hands on the wheel. The indentation marks are probably still there, wherever that car may be today. And I prayed and prayed, and now I kept my eyes open, believe me. But I prayed and I simply asked God for one thing. Help me see the road. Keep me on the road. Now, we had only lived in Colorado less than 6 months, and already I'd heard stories about what happens to people out in the eastern plains of Colorado, New Mexico, and even western Kansas and Nebraska, where there's just miles of nothing, and you get stuck in a blizzard, and you get off the road, you go into the ditch, and people freeze to death because no one even knows they are there. And this was long, long before cell phones. I prayed, and we just kept going. I mean, I looked to see the tenth of a mile markers, little pole with and every so often I could catch one of these and okay, well that's positive. At least I'm still on the road. I have no idea if I'm in my lane or not, but we just kept going. The further east we went, the lower the elevation became, and finally, as we approached Clayton, we got, maybe down to about 3,500 feet elevation. The rain changed to snow. And soon the white on the road was gone, and it was just wet. That was the worst storm I have ever been involved in, by far. And yeah, I was around for the tornadoes Palm Sunday of 65. I've had plenty of other storms since, but nothing compared to that. It was by the sheer grace of God we didn't wind up in a ditch somewhere and froze to death. That was the worst storm of my life. What about you? What's the worst storm you have ever faced? And I'm not just talking about nature's storms. I'm just talking about tornadoes, hurricanes, ice storms, flooding because of extremely heavy rainfall. No, I'm talking about those other storms. Andrew's already alluded to those. Losing a loved one, the storm of loss. Losing your job, wondering how you're going to put food on the table, how you're going to pay the mortgage. The storm of a bad medical diagnosis that's going to change your lifestyle, maybe even eventually take your life. The storm of divorce, separation. I could go on and on. The stores are many. They come in all shapes and sizes for all sorts of different reasons. Sometimes they're the result of choices we make. Many times they're beyond our control. And that's tough to deal with because we live in a society that tries to convince us that the whole world revolves around little old me and I can control everything. But when a storm comes along, we suddenly realize we can't. Now, the storm in this instance, in this text, is actually a storm of nature. Jesus and his disciples had been on the shore of Galilee. Jesus had been teaching, and as he often did, he was a short distance from shore in a boat, seated, much like a rabbi would sit in the synagogue when he would expound the scriptures. Jesus would sit in the boat, and he would teach. Well, he had been doing this for a while. The day grew late, and they decided to move on, to move to another place on the lake, the Sea of Galilee. Mark tells us that when Jesus and the disciples left, there were multiple boats. Now, Matthew and Luke don't. They just refer to one boat. Well, Mark has it right. Because the fishing boats in the first century AD, and archaeologists have uncovered one of those, are little more than a glorified or a fat canoe. You know, there's not much depth there. It might be 4, maybe 5 feet wide in the middle, and then a point on both ends. And so most likely the other boats contain the rest of the 12. Jesus is in one, most likely with Peter and James and John, maybe even Andrew. Who knows, it may have been their boats because they were fishermen. And they start making their way out into the sea to cross to the other side. Now, the Sea of Galilee isn't all that big. It's about 8 miles wide, 13 miles long, but it is 700 feet below sea level. And on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee are the Golan Heights. We've heard about those before because there's been a lot of war in that area. Well, particularly in warmer weather, spring, summer, fall, colder air comes down from those heights onto the lake and collides with the warm air that's down at the lake's surface. And particularly after a day of warming, late afternoon, twilight on into early evening, and it's getting dark, those two air forces collide and storm. Squalls, the NIV term that's used. But this is a storm. Strong winds, strong waves. And suddenly these boats are immersed in this storm. And the disciples, and keep in mind, they're not all fishermen, but even the fishermen are fearful of their lives. And some of them probably have been in this situation before. Mark tells us that the disciples are fearful of losing our lives because the boat is becoming swamped. The word literally means filled to the brim. You know, like your cup of coffee in the morning, filled to the brim. Help me wake up. The boat was almost filled to the brim. And I love this. Meanwhile, Jesus is asleep at the back of the boat on a cushion. I love that little detail. He's on a cushion, sound asleep. Now, I have known some sound sleepers in my life, but that's a new one. But maybe it was because Jesus was just at such perfect peace. I don't know. He's asleep. The rest of them are panicking like crazy, afraid for their lives. And finally, they grab hold of Jesus to wake him up. And the Greek word means they roused him. This isn't mom going into the nursery, touching her little child and say, "Come on, honey, it's time to wake up." No, they're shouting at Jesus. They're grabbing, they're pulling at him. Finally, Jesus comes to. The storm is all around. The boat rocking back and forth, water splashing in, the wind of unbelievable force. And they say, "Don't you care if we drown?" Jesus didn't answer. Instead, he just spoke 2 words. In English, we have to use 4. But 2 words. Be quiet, be still. And just like that, the winds ceased their howling. The waves became calm. The disciples, with all of their fear, could begin to get the water out of the boat. And from all appearances, Jesus just lays back against the cushion, watches them for a while, and then says, "Why are you afraid?" Well, who wouldn't be? I mean, if I'm in their shoes, I'm scared out of my wits too. Fear is a very common human emotion, especially when we find ourselves in a storm. And not just the natural kind, the other storms of life as well. Then Jesus follows up, helps us understand a little bit more what he's getting at. He says, "Where is your faith?" Where is your faith? And then as far as we know, Jesus just sits back. Maybe he falls back asleep. They continue on their journey, but all the while, they're talking amongst themselves. Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? Who is this guy? Now, they've been following Jesus for a while by now. They've seen him cast out a demon. They saw him heal Peter's mother-in-law. They saw him heal a lame man, heal a leper. By this time, they also saw him heal the man with the shriveled hand in the synagogue. But this, power over nature. I mean, for all of our technology, all of our wisdom at this very day, we know a lot about the weather, but we can't control it, not in any way, shape, or form. Who is this guy? That's a good question for all of us. In fact, it's a good question that lies at the heart, I think, of what it means to follow Jesus. Because when we take that first step to follow Jesus, when we're baptized, when we're confirmed, when we make that choice to follow Jesus, it doesn't end there. That's the first step. And then there's another and another. And sometimes those steps are hard to take because there's a lot more at stake. Sometimes it's hard to take those steps because we're really not paying attention to Jesus. We're not letting him have the reins, steer the boat, help us get to where he wants us to go. Who is this guy? When we make a commitment to follow Jesus, part of that commitment means that every day we're going to allow Jesus to show us more and more of who he is, what he wants to do with our lives, how he wants to change our lives, and how he wants to work in and through us in his world. I'm not talking about, when I say who is this guy, I'm not talking about answering with a statement of faith, with a creed, with a Bible verse. I'm talking about answering with life experiences, life choices, what we do, what we say day to day to day. Every day, we have the opportunity, when we get up, we have the opportunity to say, okay, Lord, what do you want to do today? Now, I'm like you. I have a calendar on my phone, and I will sometimes make lists of things I want to do, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's helpful to be organized at times. But it's maybe more helpful at times to be willing to say, Jesus, you take the reins. Show me what you want. This is what I've got planned, but maybe you have something different in mind. Who is this guy? We have the opportunity to answer that question every day, every week, every month and year of our lives when we choose to follow Jesus. So let me give you an illustration of what I'm talking about from my own experience. I grew up in a Christian home, went to church, went to Sunday school, learned to pray at mealtime, learned to pray at bedtime. We had a very strong Sunday school. They emphasized memorizing Bible verses. Most of the scripture that I still know by heart, I memorized back then as a child. We went to Vacation Bible School. As we got older, we got into youth group. And at the age of 11, I made a choice to ask Jesus to be my Lord and Savior. That was in February of 1964. The next month, Palm Sunday, March 22nd, 1964, I was baptized. And as I moved through my junior high and middle school years and on into through high school, I continued to do my best to try to follow Jesus. Went to church regularly, active in the youth group. I started singing in the choir when I was in the 8th grade. My voice had changed, so I could sing like a man instead of like a girl. And when I graduated from high school, I pretty much knew what I wanted to do with my life. I loved math and physics. I wanted to be some kind of some field of engineering. And that's how I started out in college. Well, after my sophomore year, August 1972, my pastor asked me, along with several other people in the church, to go up with him to Lake Louise Baptist Camp, northern Michigan. If you're familiar with Michigan, see, I'm doing this. I guess I got to do it that way for you to see it. Way up here, on this side of the state, close to Grand Traverse Bay, but quite far north in the Lower Peninsula. He was going to be running a camp for 9th and 10th grade young men and young women. He wanted me to serve as a counselor. There were a couple others that were going to be counselors. There were a couple others who came who had other responsibilities. And then there were some people who came from other churches. Well, we got up there on a Saturday. The camp began on Saturday evening. We had on a beautiful summer evening, a glorious campfire down by the lake. And we sang, and the pastor preached. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. Sunday morning, we had worship together. Not outside this time. We were in the chapel area. And then we had free time in the afternoon. And again that night, we were down at the lake around the campfire. Well, after the service that night, one of the young men in my cabin went to Pastor Joe, my pastor, and told him that he had brought weed up to the camp with him, and he had given it, or some of it at least, to some of the other guys in my cabin. Well, pastor came over and told me what was going on, and I remember thinking, okay, that explains why several of them were getting up during the night, because you could hardly get up and leave the cabin without disturbing everybody else. Explains why it wasn't because they had such small bladders. They were going out and smoking joints. Well, he told my pastor that he had thrown what he still had left. He had thrown it in the lake. But he wouldn't say who the other kids were that he had given marijuana to. So my pastor decided, well, we'll call the cabin together in the morning, and we'll have a heart-to-heart and see if anybody will, fess up. We did that. Everybody just sat looking down at the ground. Nobody said a word. So then Pastor Joe decided, well, we'll let it go the rest of the day. The young man who had brought the drugs to camp, he showed us where they were going to smoke, and yeah, you could see the burned joints on the ground. And he said he had given it to two people, and unless one of them had given some to somebody else, that would be it. But again, no names. So the pastor decided that we would give people the day to see if anyone would come forward, and if not, next morning he was going to start calling parents. Well, that afternoon it began to rain. It poured. Anything and everything we did had to be done inside. We had to hold magazines or newspapers or blankets or hats if we had them on our head going back and forth from cabins to the chapel to the dining hall. And that night when I got back to the cabin after the evening worship time, which again wasn't down by the lake because it was still pouring rain, it was in the chapel. I got back, and these guys are trying to light a fire in the fireplace because it is getting cold. This is northern Michigan, mid-August. It can get rather chilly at night that far north. Trouble was, the wood was soaking wet. Every day, the guys in the cabin had certain responsibilities, and each day, one of those responsibilities, and each day one person was responsible for getting firewood, bringing it, putting it inside the fireplace, by the fireplace so we could have a fire in the evening if we wanted to. Well, that had not been done. But they had gone and they'd gotten this soaking wet wood, and they were trying to light a fire, and it wasn't lighting. No chance. So I said, okay, guys, it's getting late. There's some extra blankets here, and I passed them out. I said, just bundle up as best you can. I know it's going to get cold, but that's what we got to work with. And so we had prayer together and turned out the lights. Well, we're laying there in the dark. And this kid on the far side of the room, near the door, just blurts out, God, we are getting cold in here. If you want us to be warm, you're going to have to light that fire. And the fireplace just burst into flames. I'm not talking about a single flame arising and then it's slowly. I mean, it's like somebody dumped a can of gasoline down the roof and then threw in a match. Just burst into flame. My bed is right here. The fireplace is right there. I saw the whole thing, and there's dead silence. Dead silence. No one says a word. Then finally somebody says, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" And yeah, we all saw it. And by now, the lights were on, everybody's back up, and there's no sleep coming for quite some time, as we talk about what we have just seen, and then say, "Hey, can we go to the cabin next door, tell them?" So I said, "Sure, why not?" Well, it wasn't too long before everybody was out in the middle of the camp in the pouring rain, singing songs to Jesus, praising the Lord. What an incredible week that turned out to be. And one of those young men in my cabin, in fact, he was the one who brought the marijuana. I ran into him 2-3 years later at a youth convention in Michigan. And we had a nice talk, and he told me that he was training to become a youth minister. That's how much God changed his life through Jesus. Who is this guy? Well, believe me, after that experience, I had a far different awareness of Jesus. This is not gentle Jesus, meek and mild. This is Jesus. Bulked up Jesus, who can do anything, anywhere, at any time. Who is this guy? I think we face that question every day. Once we make that choice, once we take that first step to follow Jesus, every day we're faced with that question. Who are we going to let Jesus be? Oh, we don't change who Jesus is. And there's nothing that can stop Jesus from doing what he wants to do. Andrew, you said that earlier. But there is one thing. And that one thing that can stop Jesus is me. And you. And you. Because we can close the door. We can shut ourselves off. We cannot let Jesus be Jesus in our lives. But oh, if we open ourselves up and we let Jesus be Lord, if every day we make the choice, Jesus, show me what you want me to do. I know I have things I need to do. I've got to go to work. But show me what you want to do with me today. How you want to work through me. We start doing that, and we start doing that more and more. We begin to discover who Jesus is in far deeper levels and in ways that are not just life-changing, but world-changing. So who is this guy? That's the question I want you to ask when you get up every morning. Jesus, help me see you in new ways. Help me discover more about you. Because if there's one thing that Scripture makes very clear, anybody who opens themselves up to Jesus Christ has their life changed, transformed, sometimes in ways that people no longer even recognize who we are. Who is this guy?